patriotism. Oh, I wanted to start with a patriotic song, and I hope you all can sing along on mute. We know what it's like when we try to sing as a choir in here. I think it's one of the most beautiful patriotic songs we have, and it's much more singable than the national anthem. Oh, beautiful for spacious skies, for amber waves of grain, for purple mountains' majesties above the fruited plains. America, America, God shed his grace on thee, and crown thy good with brotherhood from sea to shining sea. So, um, I have never heard oh, thank you. Thank you, Patty. I have never heard a message on this particular person, a whole message. I've never given a message on this particular person. And Terry, when you figure out who it is, you let me know if you ever have given a message on this particular person. I um I think he's one of the most maligned, probably hated people in the history of our world. And I think we have misunderstood him. And so we're going to talk about Judas today. And I thought a long time before trying to put this together. And even after I put it together, I thought a long time whether to offer it. But this is coming from my heart. We all know what Judas is famous for betraying Jesus. And and as I read Jewish scholars, I start to understand the incredible damage that has been done to Jewish people because of Judas. And I'm sorry, but some people just want to look for a scapegoat, no matter who it is, so they can they can live their bigotry. And I think that's what's happened for the Jewish people. And reading some of the Jewish scholars, some of the horrors. Of course, we all know about the Holocaust and Nazi Germany. Of course, we all know that, but there's so many more horrors and just terrible, terrible things that have been done to Jewish people, and many people will gladly say, well, it's Judas's fault. And what I didn't know until I was reading this one amazing Jewish scholar about all kinds of things about Jewish heritage. Um, Apparently, and I feel terrible that I didn't even know this, but I didn't. Apparently, millions of Jewish folks have died over the course of history and were killed, including in the Holocaust. And the last words that they heard before they died was Christ killer. That people have blamed all Jewish people for killing Christ, and it's just not true. It's not true. And I want to tell you a little bit about Judas. As you know, Judas was one of Jesus's primary disciples. He had many, many followers. He had many disciples. There were a lot of people, including women, that traveled around Galilee and Palestine with Jesus. And we know that from the scriptures. But we tend to think of the disciples as a group of 12 men, one of whom was Judas. Now, Judas had a very important role in the disciples. And I just don't think he got it by accident. I don't think Jesus said, "Okay, who wants to take care of the money?" I think Jesus saw within Judas something very special, and that Judas was a person that loved Jesus and the ministry and loved the other disciples. Now, why was it so important to have somebody to take care of the money? I mean, haven't thought about that a lot until recently, but remember, there was no bank on every other corner. And even if there was a bank somewhere where they happened to be traveling, there were no ATMs. There was no nationalized system of banks of America. So even if you wanted to do some sort of transaction that required a bank, there was nothing that said that you were trustworthy, that you had an account somewhere, so they would honor your transaction. And you wouldn't have had an account like we're so used to using our ATM cards. We could go to any bank, almost any bank, and get cash because they know that we have an account somewhere. And they couldn't do that. So Judas was entrusted with carrying some of the money that they had. And how did they get their money? Well, we know from the scriptures that there were people that donated goods that would have been sold for money so that they would have some cash, because remember, they were traveling all over the place. They needed money. They needed money to buy food for themselves and their followers. They needed money for lodging. I doubt they stayed in any kind of fancy place ever, but they might have stayed occasionally in a place with walls and a roof and to keep the elements off of them. So they needed money. And I can't help but think that it was Jesus that appointed Judas to be their treasurer. I I believe with my whole heart that Judas loved Jesus and that Jesus loved Judas. So let's move this to what we consider Easter week. Remember that probably the things in our scriptures that suggest that they all happened in a week probably didn't happen all in one week. But let's move it to what we consider Holy Week. So Jesus and his disciples were traveling to Jerusalem. Now, to us, we're so used to hearing about that, we don't think anything about it. Jerusalem was a very dangerous place for Jewish citizens because the Roman government that had authority over this huge city and this massive, incredibly wealthy temple that all of the Jewish people wanted to travel to at least 2 or 3 times in their lives, because it was like if you went to Washington D.C. and you didn't go see the Capitol or something. I mean, it was much bigger than that. It was a huge life event for people to be able to go to the temple. And if they were able, they took their newborn baby boys to the temple to be blessed. But everyone knew, and I assure you Jesus knew, and all the disciples knew, that it was a dangerous place for Jewish folks, because the ruler the of the government that was Roman. It wasn't like Rome, Italy today. It wasn't like that. It was governed and had been for generations by autocrats who had their own interests in mind and were really, really wealthy because they stole so much from everybody else, from the citizens. And the Roman ruler at the time, Pontius Pilate, we've heard a lot of bad things about this man, and he probably deserves them. The ruler at the time was particularly harsh on Jews because historically the Jews had been given some privileges that other citizens didn't get. The citizens of whatever Roman territory one was in were required to declare that whoever was in charge of the Roman government at the time was God. And they were required to bow down and worship either a statue of the the Roman governor at the time, or if by any chance they happened to be in his presence. And they were not supposed to consider any other being sacred and holy. And here were the Jews who were talking about Yahweh God being the creator of the universe and the benefactor of all things good and love and peace. And then along comes this Nazarene peasant rabbi named Jesus. And he starts pushing against the boundaries harder than was safe for him or his followers. And he starts teaching about that the 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 holiness of the universe, God, Yahweh, loves everybody, no matter what your heritage, no matter what your ethnicity, no matter what your gender, you're all loved. And the word about Jesus kept getting spread more and more. And then Jesus starts healing people. And that really rubbed the leaders the wrong way. No, this peasant man can't be going around proclaiming God and healing people in God's name. This is this is this is not acceptable. So all of the disciples and probably most of the Jewish people in the whole area understood that the closer you got to Jerusalem, the more dangerous it became because Pontius Pilate and the head of the temple, Caiaphas, actually they were kind of in cahoots with each other. And Caiaphas supposedly was Jewish himself, or he couldn't have been a head of the temple. But he didn't have the interests of the Jewish people in mind. He was just interested in more money and more power. So he and Pontius Pilate decided that they were going to do whatever they could to get rid of this Jesus fellow because he was a danger to their fame and fortune. And Jesus kept telling the disciples, we're going to go back to Jerusalem. Jesus visited Jerusalem many times and went to the temple. And remember, the last time that we know of when he went to the temple, he stepped into it big time on purpose. Remember what happened? He went into the court in the temple where the money changers were, that was required, that you had to exchange your whatever currency you had from where you lived. You had to exchange it for particular currency for the temple so that you could go into the temple and so that you could make your sacrifices and your offerings. And they were crooks, and they were charging huge interest rates for you to exchange your currency, but you had to do it. And that was the only place you could do it. So Jesus went into the temple, into that court, and starts a riot. And he's throwing things around and yelling and overturning the tables and making all kinds of accusations against them. Well, Caiaphas, obviously, as the head of the temple, and Pontius Pilate, and who knows who else, all heard about this. And they were furious. How dare this guy come into our place and act like this? So Jesus and the disciples were headed back to Jerusalem. The disciples were saying, "Let's not do this, Jesus. This is not a good idea." And Jesus was absolutely focused. We're going back to Jerusalem. They all knew that the possibility of crucifixion was alive and well. I read that, and there's no specific scholarship on this, but based on readings of many different sources, ancient sources, that at least 50,000 crucifixions happened during that time. 50,000, which means that almost everybody had witnessed the horror, the inhumanity of a crucifixion. And they all knew to be terrified about it. And yet Jesus says, we're going to Jerusalem. We're going to the temple. And Judas knew the writing on the wall too, and he was terrified. He was terrified for himself. He was terrified for the other disciples and Jesus' followers, and he was terrified most of all for Jesus' safety. The scriptures don't say what happened exactly, but I believe absolutely that Judas was trying to prevent Jesus from being crucified. And he didn't know how else to do it, except he thought if he told Caiaphas from the temple to have the temple soldiers arrest Jesus, he knew that the Jewish folks in Jerusalem or and remember it was during the Passover, so there were huge crowds of people going to Jerusalem that weren't ordinarily there. And he believed if Jesus were taken by the temple soldiers, that the Jewish people would not allow anyone to be crucified, because that was in their ancient heritage, in their scriptures, that it was just illegal for such a thing to happen to anybody, and certainly not to a devoted Jewish person. So he took money from Caiaphas with the understanding that Jesus would be safe. So we get to the part in our scriptures that we talk about as the Last Supper. And Jesus starts predicting his own death. And people don't want to hear it. They don't want to believe it. And remember, if you don't think they were in danger, remember they went someplace that was kind of a secret place for this gathering. They weren't out in public somewhere. And Jesus predicts his own death. And then he says something startling. Maybe he said it, we don't know. But they're sharing a meal, and it was a real meal. It was real food. It wasn't just a little crumb of bread and a tiny, tiny little sip of juice. It was real. It was real food. And he said, "This is my body given for you. This is my blood shed for your salvation." And then he said, "One of you will betray me." Can you imagine? You've been with this incredible teacher, incredible human being, turning to his most beloved, trusted small group and saying to them, "One of you will betray me." Can you imagine what the men must have been thinking and feeling, and how horrified they must have been? And Jesus said, it's one of you that is dipping into the cup with me. And according to the scriptures, Judas was next to him, which also tells you how much Jesus cared about this man, or Judas wouldn't have been right next to him. So you know the story. Judas runs out of that isolated, safe place and runs to the place that he knows Jesus will go to for prayer. And he tells the soldiers, Caiaphas' soldiers, the soldiers from the temple, he says, "The man I kiss is Jesus." So they all went to the garden, and Jesus begged the disciples to stay awake and pray with him. And they kept falling asleep. I would have done the same thing. I would have fallen asleep. And it said Jesus was so concerned that he sweated drops of blood. This was not someone who was going into this with an easy heart or being in any way not understanding what was going to happen. Now, they're praying, or at least Jesus was praying, and Judas was watching, and he sees the temple guards come. And with the temple guards were many, many Roman soldiers that Pontius Pilate sent. And they had no intention of treating this man with any kindness or compassion. And remember what happened next? Do you remember? All the disciples who had pledged their love and loyalty to Jesus, they all ran away. They all ran away. They were terrified. I would have run away. They were terrified. And remember later on that whenever that was, it was probably not all in the same day or evening or anything, but Peter, who had sworn his loyalty to Jesus the Christ, who just would have done anything he said for Jesus. Remember, some of the guards came out and thought they recognized him. And they said, "You were with that man. You were with that Galilean." "No, I have no idea. I've never seen him before." 3 times they pushed him. They pressed him. "You were with him. You were with his fault." No, no. And Jesus had said, before the cock crows, you will deny me 3 times. And he did. At the crucifixion, you know who wasn't there? The disciples. None of them. And remember what the scripture said happened to Judas? After he realized that Caiaphas was turning Jesus over to the Roman authorities and that there was no doubt that Pilate was going to make sure Jesus was crucified. According to the scriptures, Judas went out and hanged himself because of his remorse for what happened, what was happening. He did what he thought was the right thing. He was trying to protect Jesus. And he was sick unto death with grief when he realized what he had set in motion. After Jesus' death and what we call Easter, the resurrection of the risen Christ, there are in our scriptures several instances in which the risen Christ appeared to various of the disciples. Sometimes they were all together, sometimes it was two small groups of them. And they all understood that despite their own fears and their own, I hate to call it cowardice, but they were terrified. Despite all of that, and despite the fact that it appeared that they had abandoned Jesus, every single time there was any kind of meeting of the risen Christ with one of them, they received nothing but grace and love and forgiveness. And you know what? If Judas hadn't killed himself, there's no doubt in my mind that Jesus would have offered that same forgiveness to Judas. So let me tell you about a different time and a different place where somebody needed a lot of forgiveness. His name was John Newton. Name ring a bell with anybody? You'll know in a minute. His name was John Newton. He lived in 18th century England. He had been kicked out of the Navy because he just wasn't cut out for it. He wasn't well behaved. He was kind of a bad apple. And he was looking for something to do to make some money, and he heard about the slave trade, which was alive and prospering in 18th century Britain. And he got himself hooked up with some slave traders, and he decided this is a pretty good deal. So he got himself a ship, and he started going back and forth between England and Africa to kidnap people, to put them in the most horrific situations on board horrible, crowded, nasty ships. And he took them from their home and from their family, and sold them. And he did it over and over again. Now, anybody remember John Newton yet? Patty does. He wrote these words eventually. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch, that was his word for himself. How sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found, was blind, but now I see. At some point, he received into his heart and soul the forgiveness and the grace and the love of the risen Christ. And he became one of England's most well-known clergy. And he became one of the most vocal abolitionists to outlaw and eliminate the slave trade. And when he was 82 years old, after decades of preaching and teaching the gospel of Christ, somebody suggested that his memory was kind of not like it used to be, whose is, and that maybe he might want to go ahead and retire from the ministry. And he said, my memory may not be what it used to be, but I know two things. I know that I was a horrible sinner, the worst in the world, and I know the redeeming, saving, healing power of the risen Christ. And I am convinced that had Judas not killed himself out of remorse, he would absolutely have been welcomed and loved into the fellowship of Christ. And every one of us is welcomed into that fellowship. Amen.